Most of us acknowledge the importance of analyzing data and evidence. But when it comes to decision making, we often make intuition driven decisions. How can you ensure you're making data driven decisions that are void of bias and focused on clear questions that help empower your organization? Welcome to the School of Public Policy series on strategies for career and leadership success. Today, we invite you to join the conversation as we talk about data science in the context of decision-making with Marc Berson, Senior Vice President and Chief Information Officer at Gilead Sciences. Hi, I'm Whitney Sheridan, Director of Communications for the School of Public Policy at Penn State, along with Catherine Baumgardner, our Director of Professional Development and Student Engagement. Hi, Catherine, thanks for being here.
Hi, Whitney, it's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Our guest today is Penn State alumnus Marc Berson. In his current role at Gilead Sciences, Marc leads IT functions, including business engagement, IT architecture, solution delivery innovation, security controls, analytics, data management, innovation, and infrastructure operations. He has more than 23 years of experience in IT, business transformation, financial systems, and financial roles, including holding leadership positions with IBM, HP, and Royal Philips. Welcome, Marc. Thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Appreciate it.
We want to encourage your questions throughout today's discussions because this is a great opportunity for you to speak with Marc and ask him your questions today. So at any point throughout our discussion, please don't hesitate to use that Q&A window or the chat and ask him your questions, and we'll get to them anytime throughout the discussion. So Marc, data and analytics is really a broad spectrum when we talk about this field. To launch our discussion, can you talk about what we mean when we're discussing data and analytics? And
Sure.
I guess also what corporations are focused on in the data analytics realm?
Yeah, when I think about data and analytics, I kind of think about it in three dimensions. The first is foundational data management. So companies need to define data standards, codify those data standards in something like a data dictionary, and then apply those standards to transaction systems and govern the quality of data flowing through those transaction systems against those standards. So this is, kind of blocking and tackling to enable efficient transaction processing with high quality data. And, the implications of not doing that can be severe. Like, orders can be blocked in order entry systems if poor data quality, manifests. So that's the first dimension of data and analytics that I think about. The second is just kind of standard but effective business performance management. So finance, HR, procurement, legal, IT. Many of these functions have standard reports that they run, standard analytics that they derive for decision making. And then the third category that I think of, I call advanced analytics. So this is where more modern and statistically intensive algorithms can be applied, including capabilities which involve artificial intelligence and machine learning and natural language processing. But these capabilities or dimensions are a bit sequential, meaning in order to enable more advanced analytics capabilities, they really need to be built on a strong data foundation.
Gotcha.
Marc, you've got a lot of questions rolling around in my mind already. So I'm just kind of curious if you could talk with us a bit about what it means to be a data-driven organization and what that actually looks like. What are some of the behaviors that you see the leadership and professionals taking part in as they become data-driven?
Yeah, I think it primarily comes down to mindset, and that involves challenging ourselves and our teams to make informed decisions based on data. And it sounds simple, but in practice, it's not that simple because, we're all faced with a lot of decisions every day. And, we can have a tendency to have a gut feeling, rely on our experience, which isn't necessarily such a bad thing. But I think, to the extent that we can insert a data-driven mindset into our organizational culture and demonstrate that tops down, right? When our leadership team gets presented with decisions they need to make, if they challenge, those who bring recommendations forward on the data that they use to derive those recommendations, that sets a tone for the rest of the organization.
So there's an intentionality and a culture around it then.
Absolutely. And there are also, formal methodologies that can be used that are quantitative and data intensive. So we, to use your word, intentionally build skills and capabilities using those methodologies.
So, Marc, I wanted to play off a little bit about that and ask you some questions about, how other parts of these companies are able to bring data into their work sphere, because, there's been a democratization of data. It's not just a function of IT anymore, where we're able to see data in the marketing department and see those analytics. Can you talk a little bit about that and how we can have these units collaborate and how that ends up working?
Yeah, absolutely. Similar to my last response, I also think it kind of begins with a mindset, but this time I'll say the words enterprise mindset, meaning, an organization in and of itself doesn't own the data and have the rights to protect, and isolate that data from use from the rest of the company. Companies are increasingly thinking about customer journeys, an end-to-end customer journey. What's it like for a shopping browsing experience to a purchase experience to a customer support experience? And when you think about an end-to-end journey like that, those journeys are enabled by various functions across the company producing data at every step along the way. So if you were to, have a goal to improve that experience, you would need the data from every step along the way, to analyze where failure points are, pain points are, and so forth. So, it is a mindset to break down organizational barriers, to have an enterprise mindset. And like you said, to democratize by taking in functional data, storing it in an integrated data warehouse or whatever, and making that available for analytics use cases, which, span the multiple data domains.
We have some questions coming in, a couple from our director, Lillard Richardson. We're excited he's joining us because we know he's on vacation right now, sitting on the beach. So he's very into this topic. And he's asking about some things that I also want to ask about as far as some of the issues that you might have when you're dealing with data, especially things like ethics around the use of data, privacy issues, who has access, and confidentiality. If you could talk a little bit about that, especially when you have multiple units using data in one company, and also maybe you're collaborating with other companies, especially in your industry.
Absolutely. Yeah, I mean, what a lot of people don't realize is, data management and data science is a profession, right? And there are roles across a major ecosystem related to that profession. So there's identity and access management roles as a profession related to data management. There's compliance roles. For example, Europe has a good data privacy regulation, GDPR, that you need to apply. So there's consent management roles and focus. So IT often gets involved in a lot of these things. For example, when we collect patient data to study the efficacy, of our drugs, we have to get permissions from the patient for how we can use that data. So we collect their consent, we store that consent. The storage of that consent is auditable to make sure that we're, if an auditor comes in, we're only using the data based on how, the patient has allowed us to use that data, et cetera, et cetera. So, in a highly regulated industry, like the pharmaceutical industry, which Gilead Sciences participates in, all of the aspects of data management, managing access, managing consent, managing privacy, et cetera, are formal disciplines with formal roles applied to it.
And we've had these great questions. I want to remind everyone that we are really excited to hear about your questions for Marc. So don't hesitate to use that Q&A or the chat at any point throughout the discussion.
Marc, following up on the response over the use of data and the democratization of data and the ethics around data, do you find that there are conflict issues sometimes with respect to who actually shepherds the data and who kind of owns that data in the organization, and what are some of the soft skills that perhaps you need to navigate that?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that every organization has their objectives for how they want to use that data, and they tend to want to structure the data in order to satisfy their objectives. And an example that I always use is the definition of a customer. So if you ask supply chain what the definition of a customer is, they'll say, the customer is who I ship the product to, because that's what supply chain does. They ship out products. If you ask sales who the definition of a customer is, they'll say, it's who I am trying to sell to, who I am trying to generate leads. If you ask finance who the definition of a customer is, they'll say, it's who I send my invoice to, because my customer pays the bills. So, this goes back to applying data standards. It is okay to structure data to serve those multiple purposes and those multiple organizational objectives, but standards need to be applied such that there are common keys across data which make the data usable, across these different use cases. So I wouldn't, I'm not so familiar with conflicts arising in terms of data being used in a way which is conflicting with the way that it was intended to be used or that we're allowed to use it. Again, we're very careful, as most major companies are, to make sure that data is only used, in a way that doesn't conflict with those regulations. But it does get tricky, balancing the multiple objectives of how we want to use the data, and factoring that into our data standards and definitions.
And we have a great question to follow up here on that. This one is thanking you for your insight. Having been with large IT companies and service providers, do you see Gilead or healthcare industry in general understand being sensitive and managing data better compared to others? I do. Most of my career has been in the high-tech industry prior to Gilead. You mentioned, IBM, HP, Royal Philips. And I do find Gilead Sciences even more rigorous around its management of data. I'll give you an example. Pharma companies are required to do serialization at the lot and batch levels for the drugs that they produce. This is extremely discrete, data management, such that if there's ever an issue with a dosage, of medicine that a patient takes, the entirety of the supply chain can be traced back to where the raw materials were sourced, where it was produced, who, are consuming medicines from the same batch or lot, et cetera, et cetera. So these types of regulations have really required drug companies to have very rigorous data management skills. We've been talking about employing data into the workplace culture. I want to ask you about some of the career paths in data analytics. You've certainly had a great career that you've had at IBM, at HP, and now at Gilead. And I'm sure you're hiring a lot of folks. Can you talk to us a little bit about what some current students and recent grads, what's out there for them as they're starting out? Yeah. So, data and analytics is a hot career area right now, I would say. And we are hiring, we are
opening up a shared service center in Raleigh, North Carolina, and we have roles posted on Gilead.com, including data and analytics oriented roles that we are hiring for, as many other companies are. My advice would be, there are multiple entry points into a career in data and analytics. Some use computer science as an entry point. Some study finance and go into financial analysis and then broaden into broader, analytics use cases from there. So there's not necessarily one prescribed path if you're interested in a career of data and analytics. Some study statistics, and other quantitative disciplines. But, I'm an example of, someone who kind of had an unconventional, career path. When I went to Penn State, I studied finance and international business. I started IBM in finance with a job I obtained through on-campus recruiting, by the way. And, I developed an interest in financial analysis and then IT platforms which support financial analysis. And that kind of, spearheaded a broader career in IT from there. So, sometimes you wind up on a path a little bit different than, what you necessarily studied. And sometimes you use, skills that you learned in college, but, a bit more indirectly or a bit more subconsciously than you originally intended.
And what would you tell students who are getting ready to enter that job market about their expectations about some of those, what that first position might be like? Is it, when we look at data and analytics, especially when we're reading about it, it looks so exciting and this glamorous.
Not everything about it. What I described of kind of the 3 steps or 3 dimensions of data and analytics, it's the advanced analytics, artificial intelligence, machine learning. That's the glamorous part, right? My first job at IBM was correcting miscodes on general ledger trial balance runs, going through, hundreds of thousands of rows of data and finding mistakes and correcting them manually. It was not fun, but I learned a lot. I learned the entire financial data structure for the company. That is what allowed me to progress to higher value add contribution roles in the finance discipline and later in the IT discipline. And so my advice would be, your first job doesn't have to be glamorous. It has to provide you an opportunity to learn, and you may learn, just as I learned, that I didn't want to be a financial analyst for my, entire career. So, I was fortunate to work for a company like IBM, where it had a lot of diverse opportunities. It's kind of like Penn State. You can major in whatever you want, but you need to take ownership of it, right? IBM was, you can take your career in whatever direction you want, but you need to take ownership of it. So my advice would be to look for opportunities to learn, and for companies that give you an opportunity to explore various, disciplines before, kind of selecting a path that you want to progress further down from there. And your first job, doesn't have to be and probably won't be glamorous.
Great advice. Again, we are taking your questions, so keep those coming. And we do have one here from Lillard Richardson again. What are the greatest challenges for local governments in developing strong data access and analysis capabilities?
That's a good question. I'm not so close to it, but I think that local governments are going through a transformation, just like many industries are going through a transformation. Local governments are having to think about things like smart cities, right? Where light poles are IoT, are IoT devices that stream data, and how we manage that data, and how we protect the data of citizens residing, in the local areas and so forth. So every company, every industry, including government, in my opinion, they're becoming data-driven companies by necessity, right? Because data, it's cliche to say, but data is the new oil. Data is the new lifeblood that is an asset that really needs to be invested in, including the skill sets of the people who work at these organizations.
And we have another one here from one of our attendees asking, where do you see data science going in the next 5 to 10 years? I mean, it's constantly evolving. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I see data science creating the opportunity for much more automated and personalized experiences. Like, I'll give you some examples within IT, at Gilead. So we are using data combined with things like natural language processing to automate a lot of processes which today are manual. Like, if you need to get a password reset, you shouldn't have to call a help desk, wait for a human, have them reset your password, confirm that it's complete, etc. You should be able to interact with a chatbot, right? And that chatbot should be able to, speak your language. Like, I need to reset my password on system ABC, and then it goes and it takes the action, automated, touchless, comes back to you and confirms when it's complete, and it should take seconds. And you should be able to have that dialogue in the same interface that you dialogue with other colleagues, that you browse our intranet, et cetera, et cetera. And that is, more of a personalized and automated experience. And you can extend that to your experience in a number of different engagements and touch points with companies. So that's what a lot of big companies are really trying to achieve: personalized experiences which blend data and technologies in order to achieve that.
So there's a lot to unpack there, Marc. I'm thinking about the young professional or the leader in a field. You've made it very clear that wrestling with data, regardless of the path you take, is going to be an important aspect of the job experience and most likely career path. But data can be a really scary thing to people. Data also takes a lot of time, or can. So what advice would you give to young professionals or leaders for how to overcome some of what may be perceived as the barriers around being data driven? And how do they position themselves and gain a comfort level with data in that culture?
I think, when I see, people on my team and people across the organization resisting the tenets of a data-driven culture that we've been discussing, typically I find it's not it's not a fear of the data, it's a fear of transparency and accountability. So, and that's what data creates: transparency and accountability. Like, if I say, why do you make this recommendation? What data did you base it on? Is there historical precedence? Have you, looked at the probability of what may or may not happen based on your recommendation? Number one, it forces people to do homework, and not everybody likes to do their homework. Number two, data can be binary, right? Like, you either make your metric or you don't make your metric. It's either yes or no. And sometimes people resist being so binary about things because, they want to kind of live in the gray zone. So, my experience is that, number one, data can be overwhelming, but there are tools and utilities today that help us to synthesize, big data use cases and kind of make that overwhelming, experience go down a little bit. I find more of the fear and resistance towards moving to a data-driven culture around some of the softer, aspects of it that I described.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about, especially for students who are getting ready to graduate or have just recently graduated and are entering that job market, is, different workplace cultures when you're looking at jobs and data and analytics, or jobs that might be working somewhat in data and analytics. Because I'm sure whether you go to some sort of smaller boutique type firm or where you are, there's going to be quite a different type of work environment. If you could talk a little bit about that, because the expectations are certainly going to be different for the skills that you're bringing to the table.
Yes. And, so the companies that I've worked for have all had very different cultures, right? Like I worked for Royal Philips in the Netherlands. They subscribe to more of a European company culture versus, IBM, which was more of an American company culture. That's stereotyping a little bit. I know, hopefully that's not too, politically incorrect, but, Royal Philips at the time, was a very relationship-driven, consensus decision-based decision-making culture, right? Everybody had an opinion. That opinion didn't necessarily need to be substantiated with a lot of data. And, the philosophy there was by gathering everyone's opinion, we will ultimately build on each other's thoughts and get to the best collective solution. IBM, when I worked there, was much more hierarchical. I think it has, evolved since to be more collaborative, but when I worked there, it was very hierarchical, where, you were given a task and, maybe you had the opportunity to share your opinion softly, but then you completed your task. And, that difference in corporate cultures also plays a role in how data is used in the decision-making process. And you're right, sometimes less mature companies like startups with less mature processes who, are prioritizing hyper growth and, and so forth, they may not be as disciplined and structured around their use of data in their decision-making process as more mature companies that have more industrialized, processes. I also think that companies that have a manufacturing background where they've applied Lean and Six Sigma and take a very disciplined approach to reducing defects and ensuring high degree of product quality, a lot of times that data-driven culture spills over, into other functions, and it becomes the predominant corporate culture because of that manufacturing, base that they have. So I agree, different industries, different company profiles, have different levels of maturity in the way that they manage data and apply data in their decision-making processes. But I can tell you that all companies, regardless of where they fall on that maturity spectrum, aspire to progress down that maturity spectrum. It's just where they are in that maturity curve.
Gotcha. I want to remind everyone we're open for questions, and I do notice that we have some MPP students attending. So we'd love to hear from our MPP students or any of our attendees today. Just send us your question in the Q&A or in the chat at any point.
Mark, when we talked about some of the barriers or the resistance to a data-driven organization, you had mentioned one of the things was more tools that can help people to be more comfortable with the transparency and with data. You've also mentioned some techniques. You've mentioned AI, you've mentioned machine learning. If you could just tell us a little bit more about AI and machine learning, and then perhaps give us a little bit more of your perspective on what are some of the breakthroughs in analytics and science that's really driving the true transformation of our organizations today?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, so the artificial intelligence and machine learning, essentially, when you think about computer programming, uh, it has a human defining what a computer is to do through software programming, right? AI and machine learning kind of breaks that mold to a next generation of um, computers themselves can learn to adapt and teach themselves and take actions based on their own learnings instead of humans needing to, tell them exactly what to do. So that can be applied to data like, machines can analyze huge data sets that humans couldn't physically be able to analyze and derive insights from those data sets and then take actions based on those insights. So an example could be a fraud algorithm, right, that a credit card company may use or a bank may use. Like, there's millions of credit card transactions flowing, but for, a single customer, we see, a red flag, right? And so they can take an action based on that red flag of suspending your credit card until, you call and explain yourself or whatever. So the use cases that are possible with AI and machine learning are more forward-looking, more predictive, more preventative, and so forth. I think a great breakthrough in recent years, and I talked to it a little earlier, is natural language processing. Where we as humans can start interacting with machines in our own language, not a machine's language through computer programming. So in the example that I gave earlier, and we see it in our personal lives too, right? We say, Alexa, turn on the lights, right? And that's in English, and the machine takes an action, based on, there's a natural language processing engine underneath Alexa, underneath Google Home, et cetera, that converts our language into a language that a computer can understand, and the computer takes actions based on that. I think that's a fantastic advancement in technology that can be applied to analytics as well as a variety of other use cases, and really see that as the future of, the way that we will interface with computers and technology going forward.
We have another question. The way we measure something often shapes our future actions, and it can get ingrained over time. How do you include diverse voices in the construction of what you measure and analyze?
That's a good question. I mean, companies are really focused these days on ensuring that their workforce appropriately represents their customer base, their shareholder base, their stakeholder base, and also employing formal mechanisms to bring those diverse voices forward in decision-making processes. I can tell you that in Gilead, we have a lot of communities, employee-led communities, representing various employee groups. We call them employee resource groups. So we have a Black and African American employee resource group, an Asian employee resource group, a women in technology employee resource group. Women in technology, by the way, is considered a minority given their representation in the technical workforce. So that's something the higher education system should be focused on, women in STEM disciplines and so forth. And these employee resource groups play an important role in bringing the voices forward, from these diverse communities and inserting these voices into our decision-making processes and so forth. So, just like everything else, some companies are better, and more mature in the way they bring these voices forward than others. But, since joining Gilead, I'm really proud about the way Gilead manages this.
Speaking of your position at Gilead, you did mention some of the roles that are available to students who are looking to go into data science and analytics. But I wanted to ask you a little bit more about your role specifically, because I'm not sure some students might understand what it is that someone in your position as Chief Information Officer and Senior Vice President might actually do.
Okay.
Talk to us a little bit about your role.
Of course. So, first and foremost, I manage a lot of people, right? And that with managing people comes a great responsibility, right? And I manage a lot of spend, and with that, responsibility comes a lot of rigor and focus, right? If a company is entrusting you with hundreds of millions of dollars, you are expected to maximize the return on investment for that spend. So those are two important aspects. And very importantly, we keep the business running, right? So, I mentioned taking orders in, fulfilling orders, and collecting the money from those orders, reporting results to Wall Street, paying our taxes, et cetera, et cetera. Continuity of operations is a key measure of success for the IT organization. By the way, in a company like Gilead, patients' lives are dependent upon it, right? If we're not able to ship 450,000 doses of remdesivir to the Indian government to help address the COVID crisis in India, patients' lives are at stake, if we experience discontinuity of our operations. Cybersecurity, is a huge responsibility for the IT organization. There are, nation states trying to steal our, drug recipes every day, and protecting our intellectual property assets is a huge responsibility. And advancing the technologies that our workforce has at their disposal to do their jobs, right? We want to make it easier for a financial analyst to do their jobs. We want to make it easier for manufacturing operations to do their jobs. So digitize, automate, streamline, reduce the manual process elements of, their responsibilities. So those are the main dimensions, of IT.
And I imagine you're also dealing with a lot of the economic pressures that you're going through. I mean, I'm sure in the past year, there have been a lot that, a pharmaceutical company has been going through. And you're constantly probably dealing with the pressure to innovate and invest in growth and new technologies as well. So there's that as well. Yeah, if
absolutely.
You could maybe talk about balancing those responsibilities.
Yeah, I mean, what I always describe to our CFO, by the way, my boss is the CFO, right? So of course, IT is going to be expected to be very financially rigorous when you report to the CFO. So the way I describe it to my boss, the CFO, is it's not always how much we spend, it's how we spend it, right? Because if we're given $10 and we spend $9 just to keep the lights on and $1 to innovate, that's very different than if we spend $5 to keep the lights on and $5 to innovate, because the innovation is considered value producing and the run operations is considered par for the course, commodity, right? So the run versus innovate mix is a key measure of success, and we're continuously trying to drive that mix more and more towards innovation. And one thing, that I forgot to mention as like a major responsibility of IT is managing all of our vendors. So we have hundreds and hundreds of partners. Sometimes they're like a managed service partner where they conduct operations on our behalf. Sometimes they're a consulting partner. Sometimes they're a software, vendor. Hundreds and hundreds, and we need to make sure that they are performing, for Gilead at the level that we would expect, such that our, like I described, continuity of operations is at the level that our business partners expect.
You have a dynamic team and you oversee many people, as you've mentioned. You've got a lot to balance. What do you look for in people that you're hiring on your team? And what would you describe, or what are some of the things that, what does success look like, I guess, as a member of your team?
Well, I err towards attitude and aptitude, right? If you're a smart cookie and you are willing to learn, quick on your feet, flexible, don't draw boundaries about, around what you will and won't be willing to do, those are, recipe for success in my book. And the deep subject matter expertise that a specific role requires, we may need to prioritize that for specific roles, but I find that for many roles, if people have demonstrated adaptability and agility in learning new things, they can pick up the subject matter expertise quickly and be successful in the role. And obviously that varies a little bit for, more entry-level roles versus, more senior roles. But, when we're looking for new college hires, in early career types of roles, I mean, again, look at me. Like if I was hired at a school based on my computer science depth, I wouldn't have had, a career in IT, right? So agility, adaptability, attitude, and aptitude, are the attributes that I prioritize.
You're really hiring for fit first.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's great. I want to remind everyone before we wrap up, we want to make sure we take the time to give you the opportunity to ask Marc your questions. So use that Q&A or the chat at any point throughout the discussion. So Marc, do you have any tips or takeaways for better data-driven decision-making that you've been able to employ?
Well, I would say secure tops-down sponsorship, and set a tone and a culture from the top of the organization. I would say, really demonstrate transparency and work to break down functional silos, right? Employing an enterprise mindset that we discussed, right? I don't work for the IT function. I work for Gilead Sciences as an enterprise. And when we make decisions, we should be making decisions based on maximizing value for the enterprise, not our individual organizations. Again, sounds simple. In practice, there's a lot of resistance to that mindset. Cultures do not change overnight. So, one of my direct reports calls me annoyingly persistent and persistently annoying. So, persistence is also, a tenet for success. You really need to keep at this in order to really drive the culture. And, not just the culture, but capabilities, these skills are not going from, level 1 maturity to level 5 maturity overnight. And by the way, there are maturity spectrums for data management skills and analytic skills that companies measure themselves by. So it's a long-term approach and a journey that you need to be prepared to progress down.
But I like that comparison to a journey, because we're also talking about often students who might be going into that first job and looking for ways that they can start to make a difference in their own way. They might not be in that position of power that we often talk about. And you're talking about different levels of being able to make that impact. So yeah, that's very important to point out.
And such great advice, as I work with students and help them to figure out kind of where they go next and what really sparks their interest and how they pursue that passion. I'm just wondering if you have any final words of advice that might help our students as they're discerning the direction that they want to take, and if they're how data becomes an important part of their careers going forward.
Yeah, I mean, first of all, data-driven decision making isn't just applicable to our professional lives, it's applicable to our personal lives as well.
Mhm.
And applying structure to the way we go about thinking about alternatives that are, in front of us is again, a universal skill. Advice to students: enjoy your college years, and don't look for the perfect first job out of college. It doesn't exist. Be prepared to work hard. There is no secret sauce, to climbing a career ladder other than working hard and having a passion for what you do. There's a lot of great companies with great mission and purpose that really generate, a lot of passion from the employees that work at these companies. I absolutely feel that at Gilead. I mean, like I said earlier, not just, therapies that are addressing the COVID crisis, but we have an HIV, suite of drugs, an oncology, a cancer treatment suite of drugs, a virology suite of drugs for hepatitis and so forth. It's pretty easy, to get behind the mission of a company like that. And that's what, can keep you going late nights, with your individual contributions towards that mission. So have a passion for what you do, work hard. And I guarantee that if you employ a data-driven mindset within yourself, your leadership team, will recognize that, and you'll set yourself up for bigger and better from there.
Great advice. Well, thank you so much to our special guest, Marc Berson, and thank you for all of your questions. Throughout the summer, please visit our website for links to past events in our webinar series. We'll return with our next conversation on Wednesday, September 15th. I'm Whitney Sheridan with Catherine Baumgardner for the School of Public Policy. Thanks so much for joining us, and have a great day.